Today, more leaked messages from the heart of government in the heat of the pandemic. Will Boris Johnson back the Prime Minister's Brexit deal? And is it cheating to let a chatbot help with your homework? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative peer Lord Stuart Jackson, Labour MP Rushanara Ali, Daily Mirror political editor John Stevens and former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng. Today, a massive betrayal and a breach of trust. That's former Health Secretary Matt Hancock's verdict on the leaking of thousands of WhatsApp messages. The journalist who leaked them says this.
This is about the millions of people, every one of us in this country, that were adversely affected by the catastrophic decisions to lock down this country repeatedly.
As Boris Johnson gives a speech in London, is the man who said he'd got Brexit done about to back his successor's deal or sow more division? MPs clash with the Equalities Minister over the menopause.
Health conditions can be.
No, that was in response.
Will you let me answer the question, or are you just going to talk over me the entire time? The menopause is a condition that all women will go through at a particular age.
Does the government getting involved help or hinder women? And should students be allowed to use this to help write their essays? Let's start with more leaked WhatsApp messages to the Telegraph given by the journalist Isabel Oakeshott. Let's have a look at the front page, the lockdown files. Hancock's rearguard action to shut down schools. These are messages that point to the behind-the-scenes battle that was raging over whether to close schools between the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock and the then Education Secretary Gavin Williamson. As we know from yesterday, these messages were given to the Telegraph by the journalist Isabel Oakeshott, who's been critical of the government's handling of the pandemic and who helped Matt Hancock write his book, The Pandemic Diaries. Now, Matt Hancock has released a statement, the first official statement we've heard from him. Here it is, part of it. There is absolutely no public interest case for this huge breach. All the materials for the book have already been made available to the inquiry, which has started, which is the right and only place for everything to be considered properly and the right lessons to be learned. Isabel Oakeshott has justified it, saying there's huge public interest. Starting with you, Stuart Jackson, is there anything that you've heard so far that has changed your view on how the government handled the pandemic?
Not particularly. I feel that having a school-aged child that was directly affected by the decisions with respect to the opening of schools or not, I do have quite a vested interest. I think that the proper place for an adjudication on this whole area is the public inquiry, and I think there's an element that people are trying to get ahead of that now by framing the agenda. So I'm broadly sympathetic to what Matt Hancock is saying, but personally I think it was a huge mistake to close schools, and it's adversely affected many children. And there was, unfortunately, a herd mentality. There were very few people standing against that, and those that were traduced and attacked as being conspiracy theorists.
These WhatsApp messages that have been leaked, Matt Hancock says they only give a partial account of what happened. Has it changed the way you think and feel about the pandemic and the way it was handled?
Well, what this highlights is that Matt Hancock has focused on his own career and now a book that he is profiting from. Yes, he's donated some of the money proceeds to charity, but the reality is this has become, Matt Hancock's made it all about himself when over 200,000 people lost their lives. Many of us lost friends and family during the pandemic, and what we need is the inquiry to be taking place and ministers giving evidence as quickly as possible.
Right, so the messages haven't changed your mind. So is this telling you something either that you didn't know, you may be reading all of the messages that are coming out, or is it a case that you do just want to wait for the inquiry?
Well, look, the inquiry needs to take its course, but the reality is we've got government ministers. We had last year, most of last year was taken up by Partygate and the abuse of the rules by very senior people in government. Now we've got the former health secretary profiting from the pandemic and trying to rebrand himself, and it's blown up in his face, and frankly, he deserves it.
Is there a public interest case in looking at these WhatsApp messages in terms of how the government handled it?
I think that we know that the government now does a lot of business on WhatsApp. You know, in previous days, they would have done this in meeting rooms with notes taken down by civil servants. Now a lot of the business of government is done on these WhatsApp groups with people like the PM, his ministers and advisors. I think there's obviously a defence that it is right that people understand how the government did come to making those decisions. But a lot of this stuff we did know already. We knew at the time that the government failed to put a protective ring around care homes. We talk about the battle going on behind the scenes between ministers on whether you open stuff or shut stuff. It was going on, you know, in front of scenes. We had that playing out in newspapers, different ministers briefing against each other. We knew that Matt Hancock wanted to shut things down while other ministers wanted to keep them open.
Well, let's just give you a flavour of some of the WhatsApp messages from today. This is an exchange between the former Education Secretary and the former Health Secretary, and they have been discussing the availability of teachers' access to PPE, protective clothing, Anita. Gavin Williams says some will just want to say, teachers, they can't, so they have an excuse not to teach. They can't get access to the protective clothing. Matt Hancock responds, cracking announcement today. This is to do with exams. What an absolute bunch of arses the teaching unions are. Is it enlightening to lift the bonnet, if you like, on conversations like this between government ministers?
I've been a special advisor. I know that sometimes these things have to take place and you have to build relationships between different cabinet ministers. You have to have those informal conversations. I think, honestly, it's generated a lot more heat than light. Like, as John says, we have a sense of what happened behind the scenes and some of the decisions that ministers were grappling with. And I do think that actually it's difficult to conclude on the basis of a two-person exchange what they actually thought about any of these issues and the other reasons why they might have said it. And I do think that actually being able to see all of the messages in the round with a proper inquiry is the best place to allow us to have a proper assessment and reach a conclusion about the handling of the pandemic.
How would you have described the teaching unions? I mean, is that the sort of language you would expect in those sort of WhatsApp messages that no doubt ministers thought would be kept private?
Well, some teaching unions and teachers did not cover themselves with glory. Some did extremely well, and they could be very proud. But remember, Joe, we were in a situation which was completely unprecedented. We saw on our television screens the possibility from Italy in early 2020, hundreds of thousands of people dying. You cannot, in hindsight, now say, well, ministers should have done X, Y and Z. It was very, very
But isn't
difficult.
that what the inquiry is going to do? They're going to look at exactly those decisions and why they took them.
They are. And actually, I don't have a problem with those WhatsApp messages because some of the teachers were obstructive and difficult. Some public servants were obstructive and difficult. The vast bulk of public servants were fantastic and delivered the goods on dealing with this issue. But, you know, we have a situation fundamentally where there has been a breach of trust. I don't agree with Rushanara about this. Matt Hancock, I think, did a reasonably good job in very difficult circumstances.
What do you think about those WhatsApp messages?
I think it's disgraceful that public servants are being spoken of in that way and union leaders are being spoken of. People showed great courage and resilience during the pandemic in all walks of life, the public sector and the private sector, and ministers being unprofessional in this way just because it's a private group and calling names, that particular expletive is frankly one deserving of the ministers using those words, not the public servants who were showing great courage and Downing
Street have said they don't agree with it and they wouldn't use that sort of language, and whether or not they're in WhatsApp messages or not, these are and were thought to be private conversations.
But private conversations where expletives are being used and terms of abuse being used is completely unacceptable. We wouldn't tolerate that among any other profession. Why is it right that ministers should be talking about...
You've seen plenty worse, have you?
You know, in private, I've been a special advisor. Anita's been a special advisor. These people
I'm sure Anita didn't use that.
Oh, Anita!
What I'm saying is, in a high-pressure, 24/7 situation, unprecedented national
It's no excuse.
national
Just like
challenge.
it's no excuse for
Some
breaking the rules that the government introduced over Partygate.
But Roshana, I think we can all agree
hypocritical.
that no one would want all of their WhatsApp messages to be made public.
No.
right?
Sure, of course.
And there might
Nodding
be,
sagely here.
I think we can all agree about that.
To someone. To
Well, that's
help him
true. I mean, he
ghostwrite a
did
book.
hand them over, didn't he?
Yeah,
That's
he
a different
did.
question.
Well, yeah, whether he was right to and whether he was
And
incredibly naive.
do you expect us to be sympathetic to somebody who's
All right.
handing it over so that he can profit from a ghost-written book?
Well, there are going to be many more of these WhatsApp messages. That I can be pretty sure of coming out in the coming days and weeks. We're going to talk about something completely different, and that's the government's approach or politicians' approach to the menopause. There was an exchange between the Women and Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, and the Menopause Action campaigner, Carolyn Harris, in the Commons. And this was about over whether there should be a pilot, whether firms should give women with the menopause a pilot or leave from work. Let's have a listen.
You are speaking from a left-wing perspective on creating something. I am speaking from a right, centre-right perspective. I do not think. I'm sorry. I do. I think that it influences the approach that you take. I do not think creating another pilot on more leave is what is going to help women who have the menopause.
Let's have a look at Labour's headline here in The Guardian about what they are going to do. Says it will urge UK firms to publish menopause action plan. Stuart, do you agree with Kemi Badenoch in terms of the idea of a pilot for firms to give leave to women with the menopause?
I do agree with her. I think the Equality Act is a landmark piece of legislation, but what we don't need is more legislation. We don't need legislation by anecdote. We don't need grievance legislation. We need legislation in place, which we already have, to protect people's rights and make sure they're not discriminated against. Actually, Labour's policy I don't have a problem with. And can I just say, I think Carolyn Harris is an excellent MP, a great campaigning MP, and she's very well liked. But again, this committee shows Caroline Noakes grandstanding as usual.
Tory MP.
Tory MP. And trying to talk over the minister and be disputatious for the sake of it. I don't think we need any more laws, but Labour, I think probably Labour's policy does have merit.
Well, I mean, she's not here, of course, Caroline Noakes, but she would no doubt defend her position in terms of getting the government to take perhaps more seriously in her eyes. But the government is making moves on this issue. Roshana, it's introducing a flat-rate prepayment prescription charge over a year. That'll make it cheaper and easier to get hormone replacement therapy. Isn't that enough?
Well, look, I think that it's really great what Caroline, so the two Carolines.
Yes, Caroline Noakes, the Tory, and Caroline Harris for Labour, yeah.
It's a really important campaign that my colleague Caroline Harris has led, because women have suffered in silence for generations, and I think we do need to have an appropriate way of dealing with their ability to be in work, where they're having to take a lot of days off work. So providing support within the NHS is important. Employers providing support so that it doesn't damage our economy. You know, at a time when the Chancellor's trying to help people get back to work, you know, those who've chosen not to return to the labour market. This is part of a wider ecosystem that we need to create if we're genuinely keen to increase growth in our economy, and that means making sure those women who are suffering get the support they need.
Stuart? I mean, the government does want to see more over 50s get back into the workforce.
Yeah, and I think the most progressive employers are keen to bring women back into the workforce and keep them in the workforce and support them if they need a medical intervention, for instance. But I think new bespoke legislation on this is not what's needed, and it will be very divisive.
All right, it is Caroline Harris, Labour, coming from a left-wing perspective on this.
Well, I think Kemi was responding to the question around whether you need to have leave.
Yes.
And the idea of saying to people women need to be kind of removed from the workforce for a period of time maybe isn't the thing that would allow, as we've been talking about, accommodation within the workplace, rather than saying kind of women go away and sort out your problem with the menopause. Why don't we have a situation where we talk about adaptation? And I think a lot of what the government's doing is how do you get workplaces, Portland, for instance, where I work, is very good and has got a menopause policy that allows people to kind of work out exactly, how they might manage in the workplace rather than kind of... So I do think that there are some smart things we can do that make it much more normalised. And I think that one thing that Caroline Harris and Caroline Noakes have done is really make it a conversation. But I think I'm with Stuart that I think the answer to the challenge around how you tackle the societal perception and conversation around menopause doesn't it doesn't feel like legislation is quite going to do that. And it's going to be, honestly, more difficult than that to change norms and allow it so that women, especially those going through the menopause, but later in life, can still participate fully in the workplace.
What did you make of her comments, left-wing perspective, that's what Labour are doing?
Well, it's classic Kemi Badenoch, isn't it? Just trying to find a row wherever she goes. I mean, I wasn't surprised by it at all. We know that she's quite confrontational. I mean, we know that Caroline Nokes is quite able to make her own case, and Caroline Harris has been
she's a shrinking violet, John.
She's been a firm campaigner, but we know that Kemi Badenoch clearly wanted to have a row here, turned it into a left and right wing thing, rather than it be, let's try and find out some practical solutions, how we can actually help people. And there has been research showing, as everyone said, problems with people leaving the workplace. I think Channel 4 did a programme last year. They found 1 in 10 women are aged between, I think it was 35 and 55, who had suffered the menopause, that they had 1 in 10 of them had said they'd had to give up work because of it. They'd had to leave their jobs. And so, yeah, I think people have to be sensible, get around the table and work out ways that the people can be helped, rather than turning this ridiculous row in the House of Commons.
A ridiculous row? I mean, YouGov polled this month, 35%, last month I should say, 35% of Britons think companies should have to put menopause policies in place by law. 40% think it should be on a voluntary basis. But it's still quite a sizable number of people, isn't it?
Yeah, I think if you ask most people, here's a thing you don't like, should there be a law against it, people agree, right? But I think our role here is to understand that with complex issues in society, it requires more than that. And I think legislation may not be necessary, it may not be sufficient for tackling the problems that we face. And there are many areas where actually tackling the perception is so much more important than basically being able to say to a business, by the way, you're not allowed to not discriminate. And most businesses don't know that they might be discriminating, or might not know that they're not treating people fairly. And there's more work to be done to educate.
We're working with business, with employers, to make sure that there's a proper policy programme in place so that women who are suffering, and people have there are different effects on women when they're going through the menopause, that they get the support that employers can provide, so that they don't have to leave the labour market and they're not suffering in silence. So I think we've got to be pragmatic. We need to make sure there's a proper framework to support people. But I mean, personally, I don't support the idea that it should be a protective characteristic. I think within the equalities framework, you can do quite a lot to make sure that the provisions are in place to support women in the labour market, just as you would do with other issues.
I think it's analogous to mental health. I mean, that hasn't been the subject of targeted legislation. Nevertheless, there's been huge advances in the last few years in employers understanding the challenges of mental health and helping men and women deal with those issues.
I mean, one of the other things that Kemi Badenoch said is that the government risks being spread too thinly if it's mandating on issues like this or bringing in new legislation when there are things like cost of living pressures. Do you think she's got a point there?
I think that actually it's in our economic interest to make sure that women are properly supported, because if they're not and they're going through... I mean, we saw this recently when they couldn't access HRT treatment and appropriate medicine because of a shortage in terms of what was available, and that was causing huge issues. And some women face, suicidal thoughts. There are really severe effects of the menopause. So it's in our economic interest as well as societal interest to provide the appropriate support to women.
Do you agree with Kemi Badenoch on that? That government risks being spread too thinly if it is, in her sort of broad paraphrasing of her words, getting involved at this level with new laws on things like the menopause?
Well, things should be evidence-led, so the government will have to respond to this report with its own evidence, and if there is a problem, they will have to make a decision. I think just constantly legislating, trying to find timetable for legislation is not a way to govern. You actually need to consolidate the progress you've made previously to deliver for women on all sorts of areas. So I think, broadly speaking, I agree with her.
All right, let's turn to this headline in The Times, because, as you heard in the headline, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been making a speech in the centre of London, talking actually broadly about soft power. But, of course, the government is waiting to hear his verdict on the Windsor framework. Boris Johnson here, it says in the headline, to raise concerns about Rishi Sunak's Brexit deal. Let's just have a listen to what he said.
So when I look at the deal that we have now, I, of course, have mixed feelings. I'm conscious of where the political momentum is and people's deep desire just to get on. And this has got to be about the people of Northern Ireland, the 1.9 million people, their businesses and their lives. And given that we have got rid of the bill, I can see why so many people are attracted to accepting a compromise. And I agree passionately with Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, for whom I have the highest regard, that the people of Northern Ireland need their assembly and they need their government. And it's not for me to advise Sir Geoffrey, but I hope that he can find a way of reconciling himself and his party to this outcome, which is the fact that we have, and getting back into Stormont.
Oh, well, Boris Johnson seems to be giving it the thumbs up. Do you agree with him?
Of course. I mean, we all want...
What, you just agree with everything Boris Johnson says, Jackson?
No,
or...
I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we were told that these changes that the EU have brought forward, which they had, and I'm not being churlish, so I agree with what they've done, were impossible, and they were so-called magical thinking. And, in fact, they were always possible. So good on them.
Boris Johnson couldn't achieve what...
Well, because he was clearing up the dog's breakfast left by Theresa May in 2 years of completely fruitless negotiations, because from a position of weakness. The fact they have come to the table was because the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill was on the table.
Right.
And as Teddy Roosevelt said, you know, talk softly but carry a big stick. And I think that's why we've got to position where we are. But broadly speaking, I think he will not kick up a fuss, and he will support the Windsor Agreement.
Well, do you think they'll be breathing a huge sigh of relief on their away day? Rishi Sunak and Conservative MPs have gone on an away day because there's been welcome broadly. We haven't yet heard from the Democratic Unionist Party, but give us the analysis of how important and significant Boris Johnson's words are.
Well, I think that his decision there, I mean, he said that for the last few days he's been busy studying the deal. There's a lot of Tory MPs who are critics of him, who say maybe if he spent more time studying his own deal, we may not have got into this mess. But I think clearly his statement there is just an acceptance of the political reality of you haven't got Tory MPs up in arms saying, bring back Boris, he's our hero, get rid of Rishi Sunak now. In the Commons, when Rishi Sunak brought that deal back the other day, there wasn't really much dissent from the Tory backbenchers. And I think Boris Johnson realised this isn't the moment for him to try and make yet another comeback. It's the time for him to keep quiet and let Rishi Sunak get on with governing.
Do you think it is now more likely that the Democratic Unionist Party is going to come on board?
Well, I mean, they've obviously, the last few days, been making a few comments. They're also saying they're going through the deal. But from everything that Geoffrey Donaldson has said in public, it sounds like he was on the side that he would accept it. But we know that the DUP isn't just one group of people that all think in the same way. And I think the question is, can he keep the hardliners in his party on side?
Do you think Rishi Sunak's out of the woods then on this?
I think too early to tell. I think that in terms of the deal, there is no doubt. I mean, Boris Johnson's words were revealing there when he said, well, it looks like the momentum is going in one direction. So in terms of the backbench revolt, we know we were reading the reports of 100 rebels just as soon as last week, and there's no evidence that that is materialising. But the most important thing, as Rishi has always said, is that you actually end up with an agreement that people in Northern Ireland get behind. And I think it is a little too early to kind of say that that's totally the case, partly because of the dynamics within the DUP.
It may be a little too early. Labour, of course, have already said that they would back Rishi Sunak. So a triumph for the Prime Minister.
Well, look, the Prime Minister's cleaning up the mess that the former Prime Minister left behind.
Which one?
A succession of messes, actually, by each Conservative Prime Minister. We are doing the responsible thing in making sure that the current Prime Minister gets the support to make sure that the Northern Ireland peace process is not put at risk, and that we can ensure that the government resumes. But there's a wider issue, which is that the Brexit deal that was negotiated, has still left huge outstanding issues for the wider economy, with a 4%, possibly more, hit on our economic output. And so we do need to make sure we have a better different kind of relationship with the European Union partners than what we had under Boris Johnson and his predecessors.
Well, that brings us to the campaign ahead, of course, for the general election. We're expecting next year. As I mentioned, Conservative MPs are on a fun away day with the government and Rishi Sunak. Drinks, dinner and a quiz, I think, is on offer, as well as discussing the strategy for the next election. Helpfully, this week, the Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove has already offered some thoughts on what that strategy should be in terms, in his words, of calming down cultural divisions. Let's have a listen.
It's the radical social change activists who want to identify, create and magnify divisions. They're the people who want to tear down and transform, who demand repentance and self-abasement. Where they bring discord, I want to see harmony. I want to bring peace to our cultural wars.
Do you know what he's talking about exactly, Stuart Jackson, when he's talking about cultural wars? Are these matters that concern people?
Absolutely, and the Brexit debate has brought forward a realignment, not around left and right, about culture. And that's basically the fact that a group of people, younger graduates, metropolitan, liberal, cosmopolitan, have captured the commanding heights of the media, the bureaucracy, the civil service, etc., etc. And there are a group of people who care about national identity, place, community.
And what's your evidence for all of that?
Well, there's been quite a bit of evidence in academic circles. If you look at Matthew Goodwin, Professor Matthew Goodwin...
Freedom of speech issues and no platforming.
And the point is that latter group feel estranged from their own government and in certain senses their own country. And so there is a lot to be gained from a party that seeks to represent that latter group of people.
And this has all happened while the Conservatives have been in government for 12 years.
And it's been a failing of the Conservative Party not to more robustly push back on that trend.
Right. Rishinara, do you agree?
I don't know what to make of it, apart from the fact that this, while there are important social issues that need to be debated and worked through in our society, what we've seen is the Conservative Party trying to divide communities, divide our country, because it's frankly a diversion from their failures of 13 years of being in government, austerity, economic crisis, the Liz Truss fiasco where she crashed the economy, and what they have left is it's a set of spurious debates that they want to bring about to cause division in our country. And people are not going to let them off the hook, because when it comes to their mortgages, their rent, their cost of living, that's what they're really concerned about. And it's really ironic that Michael Gove's making this speech, because, you know, these are the people who are in power and they're not bringing people together, and the best way to do that is to address the cost of living crisis and fix our economy that the Conservatives have broken.
Right, are you saying that your constituents don't care particularly about issues, cultural issues, the sorts of things that Stuart was talking about and Michael Gove is alluding to?
My constituents are concerned about bread and butter issues. They are concerned about whether they can pay for their energy bills, whether they can pay their mortgages. Their mortgages are going up because of the Liz Truss fiasco.
And it is a diversion, isn't it, Stuart?
It's about whether they can survive. Of course, the other issues matter. There are certain debates that will come up, that whether it's about anti-discrimination, whether about gay rights. These are important issues that we work very hard as a society to make sure there are proper protections that can't be dismissed out of hand. But people fundamentally are really worried about their economic circumstances, about their jobs, about their livelihoods, about their pay, about inflation going up. That's what they're really worried about. And the government is trying to divert attention by trying to divide people in our country. And they're not going to succeed.
That would be a much stronger analysis of the situation were Labour to have fully costed proper policies put in place.
Right, but hang on,
and the fact is, it's £55 billion
of tax cuts and public service
just bringing forward these canards. Liz Truss crashed the economy.
Well, she did.
The OBR,
don't talk over each other.
The OBR were out by £36 billion in terms of their...
But Stuart, answer the question about it being a diversion. Rishinara's point that it's a diversion from, as she sees it, failed economic policies.
No, I disagree with that. I think it's actually across party lines, this cultural divide. People do care very much about their community, national identity, local pride. And I think to dismiss those people as backward-looking bigots and xenophobes, not you, Rishinara.
They care about those issues, of course, but what they expect of their government government is not to drive a wedge between citizens, which is what the Conservative government is trying to do. And that's not going to work, because actually people don't want to be divided. What we saw during the pandemic is a country coming together in the face of great adversity. That's the spirit of this country. And what the Conservatives, certain elements of the Conservative Party, not all, are trying to do is drive a wedge between citizens. And we shouldn't allow that.
Anita?
One of the reasons why I'm a huge fan of Michael Gove is because I think that he has the bandwidth and, frankly, the confidence to wade into kind of very contentious issues with very thoughtful analysis. And I think, actually, he's kind of agreeing with both of you. He talks about the challenges around economic dislocation. He talks about the challenges around inequality. He also talks about the challenges of polarisation in our politics. And I think, actually, that, you know, the question of diversion almost doesn't arise, because we've seen this happen across most of the Western world. Conversations and debates about language, about how we treat minority groups. So it's not something that has been created by the Conservative Party. And just to finish the thought, I think that what we are seeing is Michael is, I think, accurately reflecting the need to, as Conservatives, always being champions of opportunity and champions of groups, but actually talking about some of the ways in which that has served to fracture our society and the way that we need to do things differently. I think it's a very nuanced point, and I don't think, actually, he's really weighing in on the question of whether this is an election-winning or losing strategy. No, I think it's much more about what we need to see as a society and our vision, and some of that's got to be challenging some orthodoxy on both sides that is very dogmatic and unwilling to look at some of the nuances of identity politics, but also got to be about healing those divisions.
But there's plenty of people in your party, Anita, who think that you can win the next election by stirring up culture wars, that you can distract people from the cost of living crisis, that you can distract people from the problems going on with the NHS, and it's not going to work. We saw that in the Australian election last year. Scott Morrison was struggling, and to try and mask his inadequacies, he tried to stir up rows about trans athletes in sports, and it didn't work. And the Labour Party in Australia just said, you've got nothing else to say, that's why you're doing it, and they managed to diffuse the situation.
So what is the evidence that Rishi Sunak is stirring up a culture war? And it was like, his 5 pledges are literally about debt, about inflation.
Yeah. Well, no. Let's look at the people who are in Rishi Sunak's cabinet, the people he's chosen to put in his cabinet. We've got Suella Fernandez in there. We've got Lee Anderson back now as deputy chairman of the Tory party. Don't tell me that Rishi Sunak doesn't want a culture war.
They're speaking about things that don't matter, are they? I mean, stopping the boats, stopping illegal immigration is not important, is it?
Bringing back the death penalty, as Lee Anderson put forward. Well, I'm just saying these are the sorts of things we discussed this yesterday.
40% of people, Joe, support
No, I'm just saying, are these the sorts of things that you want to discuss?
This London-centric approach, you know, it's just about people who don't really know, low information people.
Where's anyone on this panel said that, Stuart? They haven't.
It's totally...
Hang on, let Rushan and I'll come back to you, Anita.
It's very divisive, this idea that you can use London as a term of abuse. You know, I'm a proud East Londoner, right? And I think using that kind of disparaging language...
I was a London Borough Councillor, so...
Yeah, so this, you know, there are... Some of the poorest people are in London, so I think, you know, I'm a great believer in devolution of power, opportunity, and making sure we are a more equal society and resources are passed on to other regions. But please, let's not divide our country. You've just done it right now. You know, I have some of the poorest children in my constituency, but the idea that you should turn one part of our country against another is just a case in point.
No, I'm just saying that you have to have a perspective which looks outside the M25. You have to look at the North West, the Midlands, South Wales, the North East. It's not just about the prejudices of people within Greater London
as a term of abuse.
I mean, does Labour need to talk about these issues more? I mean, Tony Blair, the quote is, he said, the right knows they're onto something with these cultural issues. Keeping your head down isn't a strategy. There is a big cultural battle going on. Now, this is from some time ago in the last couple of years, but is he right?
But clearly there are knotty issues, and some of these issues are really tricky to work out what is the right thing to do, how do you balance different people's rights? If there was an easy answer to these things, then we wouldn't have a row about them. But the way to sort these things out isn't in a situation where you've got people pouring petrol on the flames, trying to stir it up just because they want an argument, not because they want to find a sensible
It's not a
solution
one-way
about how
street,
to move
though,
things
John.
forward.
People the cancel culture is ending people's careers as we speak. It's not a one-way street.
So I'm still waiting for John to give me an example of the policies that Suella and that Rishi Sunak has announced that is stoking up this culture war. I think you're basically saying that the fact that people...
It's about having a row.
No, but hang on. But you're saying that what evidence seems to be there are people in the cabinet that might have a view about a cultural issue, and the fact that he even has them in his cabinet is an indication that he wants to start an election-winning campaign around it. I just don't think the evidence is there, and I actually think that this notion that I think sometimes that there is a kind of broad attempt within the Conservative Party to fight a campaign about that, I just don't think is borne out by the evidence of the policies that we've seen announced from Rishi Sunak.
Except Michael Gove, of course, alluding to it in his speech.
He's talking about the challenges that we have in our society. Again, I don't think there was evidence that he was trying to stoke up a culture war.
Well, on that, let's move on to The Guardian headline on ChatGPT allowed in international baccalaureate essays. Content created by chatbot must be treated like any other source and attributed when used, says the International Baccalaureate. This is a good alternative, according to them, to A-levels, the International Baccalaureate, and they have entered into a discussion about how AI should or could be used to help students with assessed work. Let's talk to Dr. Mari Aitken from the Alan Turing Institute. Hello to you. It's the National Institute for Data Science and AI. We've got this new technology. How's it being used?
Yeah, I mean, it's been used in lots of different ways. I mean, ChatGPT is a large language model, so it's been trained on a huge data set of human language, and from that it can recognise patterns in human language and predict what words or what kind of structures of human language are likely to be appropriate in a given context. So we know it's being used by students in drafting essays and drafting assignments, as well as being used in a wide range of sectors and a wide range of domains. But what's really important to know about this is that all it is doing is finding patterns in language and producing outputs which seem convincingly like how a human might write or what a human might say in those contexts. But it has no ability to understand those words. It has no ability to understand the meaning or the implications of what those words are. So I think it's, we saw when ChatGPT was first released, there was a lot of concern about how this might be used in cheating, how it might be used to, plagiarize assignments or outputs. But I think, as there's more experience of how it's actually being used, it's beginning to be recognised more as this is potentially a tool that students can use to structure and format outputs. But if you rely on it actually for the content, it's perhaps not going to help you. It can't be relied on factually accurate content, and it can't be relied on to provide you any kind of analytical or critical thinking, which is what we often are really looking for in students' assignments.
So whose side are you on? Oxford and Cambridge apparently are banning the use of it in assessed work. Others are considering it.
Yeah, and I think we're still at the stage where we need to really consider the full potential impacts and uses of this. We're seeing these tools integrated into lots of different applications and softwares. ChatGPT has been integrated into Bing Search. We're going to see other similar large language models being deployed in different contexts. And the example of ChatGPT, being deployed in Microsoft products, I think we're likely to see this as in the future as being more like a tool that can be used to facilitate essay writing, but not to actually craft the ideas or the outputs. And I think that's really important. And it's really important to raise, awareness of the limitations of what these tools can actually do.
Right. Mari Aitken, thank you very much. Is it cheating or should it be embraced, Stuart?
Yeah, I'm showing my age now, really.
Well, you're not alone.
I'm not alone. I do think that this is a big paycheck for lawyers. I think you will have a lot of students trying to sue this company that produces it. I don't think it's right. I think there should be a level playing field. They should ban it completely across all examination boards. Do
you?
I really do, because I do think it undermines the very concept of proper study.
Is it inevitable, though, Rishanara?
Well, look, we know technology can be a force for good, is a force for good, but there needs to be proper arrangements, including potentially regulation around what is acceptable or not, because otherwise, you're right, you're not going to have a level playing field. I think also we need to be careful about allowing AI to encroach on the human capabilities
and
creativity, and we do need to have a clear, some clarity around what the appropriate balance is. So I'm afraid I'm going to side with the Oxford and Cambridge universities.
Yes, and ban it from the assessed work. Well,
absolutely. But I do think we need to look at this very carefully and more broadly about the risks and dangers posed by AI if it's taken to the extreme.
Yes,
it's got, as I say, it's got huge potential, but we need to get this balance right.
Or are we all a bit behind the curve on this? I mean, students were well ahead. You're a bit younger, of course.
Well, I still
John.
feel behind the curve on this one, but I mean, it seems at the moment it isn't at the point where it can produce you a proper, fully formed essay with proper arguments in there. I think actually, if you
but that's the thing. It might not be.
If you put more input in there, you don't just write, give me a 2,000-word essay on this. If you explain more about the structure you need, the writing style, I think you would get out results which might resemble more something that you might need to pass some sort of essay exam. But we all know, the whole point of learning is you read stuff, you process it, then you analyse it, you work out an argument from it. And if that's not involved in your studying, if you're purely typing in, give me this, and then it gives you that, well, what's the point of that?
Yeah, I think, this is fascinating, and there's so many elements of AI that I'm doing a lot of thinking about at the moment. And I think the difference is we're now in the kind of generative AI stage where AI is producing content.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges around that is that as Myra says, it has some benefits in being able to kind of instantly provide and synthesize information.
Yes.
But as a student, that's one of the crucial skills you need to learn. And so I think there might be contexts in which it does work, but for assessed work where you really want pupils, also in the working world, to understand how to actually accurately craft language. A lot of what you get from these things is kind of general platitudes, but students learning how to craft essays that actually involve
and
communicating language, I think is incredibly important. So I think there are potentially really exciting uses for this technology. It doesn't feel like students writing essays is the one that we should be focusing on.
Right. Are you excited by it, John, or fearful of it?
Well, I was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking, oh gosh, we're all going out for
especially.
Well,
yes.
But then I was thinking, political
That's reassuring, Stuart.
Actually, no, Joe, it's all about talking to people, getting the gossip from people. And if you can get a robot that can go into the stranger's bar and pick up tidbits about what's actually going on in the government, then good luck to them.
Won't buy you a drink, though.
I also think the point about creativity is particularly important, because journalism isn't just about the information, it's about how you create a story and a narrative. And I think we haven't seen a lot of evidence that AI is able to tap into humour, for instance, or all those other things that make it special. And especially, I just want to say, in the music industry and those kinds of industries, I think there needs to be really careful safeguards around areas like that where we need human creativity in that sector to
Where does it end? This could be quite dystopian, actually, if AI is not controlled properly.
Well, I think it is dystopian, isn't it, in every sense? Dr. Mari Aitken, I think you're still with us listening to this. Do you think it will destroy creativity, the sorts of things our guests have been talking about today?
Yeah, there's very real concerns around this. We've seen, ChatGPT and GPT-3, which came before this, being used to draft blog posts, to write poetry or song lyrics in the style of particular genres or even particular artists. And there's been a lot of speculation about how this could be used in the future. And of course, real concern, that there's the potential for this. These models are trained on data of previous work, which is not attributed or credited, and artists whose work might be used within that process are not paid for their data being used in that way, but it can be used to then replicate or create outputs which mimic that style and mimic those outputs. Right. And that is really concerning. But whether it can actually itself produce creative outputs, no, I don't think it can. All it can do is mimic and regurgitate what has gone before.
Dr. Aitken, thank you very much for joining us. A policy response, you said you'd like to see it banned from all examination boards. You'd like to see it more regulated. What are the sorts of things that you might do or look at?
Well, we do need a really proper, clear process around regulating AI, both at a national level and international agreements. Because if you look at the study that was done in January, I think that was by Oxford University, about the kind of dangers of AI if we're not ahead of the curve as states, then you can find yourself in deep trouble as societies. So I think we need to, and we've seen that happen with the internet and online harms. We're coming at it very late in the day in trying to retrospectively put in protection. So I think we should
Well,
get ahead of it.
before I go on ChatGPT myself, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. Politics UK on tomorrow at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.